Content warning, there's a whole bunch of stuff about racism and acts of pretty brutal violence. So if that's a thing that you don't want to be watching at this time, please come back later or maybe give this one a skip.
Huge numbers of Americans watched this play out on their television sets, and the ending was incredibly horrifying.
It was the late 80s, and everything was looking up. If you just so happen to be a violent white supremacist, that is. The Fort Smith sedition trial saw 13 prominent white power activists get acquitted despite setting up a violent terror network across the United States. It really seemed like not only was your movement going to get away with literal murder, but that you even had support from mainstream society. Things are just a little bit too politically correct for them to articulate that, but the Soviet Union was still a threat, and you could use that to grow your movement by couching white supremacy in the guise of anti-communism. Your plan was intact. Wait until the missiles start flying, survive the apocalypse, and build your white supremacist state in the ashes. Everything was going great. But then... oh no. It's all coming to an end. The Soviet Union, communism's version of the guy outside spinning a sign, is gone. People have hope for the future? There's some guy talking about the end of history? But if people aren't scared, how will the white power movement play out its racist fantasies? Luckily for them, the next step is actually not that difficult. You just need to find a new boogeyman. Maybe you just need to rebrand a little bit. Instead of Zionist occupational government, you say New World Order. Instead of Jews, you say globalists. Oh, and most importantly, call the white power movement the militia movement. That might help, but is it enough to really get the apocalyptic juices flowing? Well, don't you worry one bit about that. The police are all militarized now and happy to oblige. So, today we're going to talk about the white power movement's rebranding, as well as massive clashes with the police at Ruby Ridge and Waco, both of which would ramp up this sense of impending apocalypse. Something that would be so scary to them, at least one would go on to commit the worst terrorist attack in US history before 9/11. But first, you know who has never rebranded their hateful past to mainstream white supremacy? This video's sponsor, Skillshare. Jesus Christ, I'm sorry. Warning, Tristan will be talking about his Dungeons & Dragons hobby again. Please remain calm. All comments complaining about this will be considered an act of war. Well, guys, I did it. The one thing I thought I'd never sink to. I'm getting into Dungeons & Dragons miniatures, painting them, and now potentially making them, which is quite the project. Luckily, I always have one place to learn how to pick up new skills, and that's Skillshare. You know about them by now. Skillshare's learning community where millions come together to learn about subjects like illustration, design, photography, video, or freelancing. You can master whatever skill you wanted to get into for advancing your career, or I guess in my case, making it even more fun to play pretend in my dining room with my friends, once they're allowed to visit. To learn how to make custom miniatures, I began with a class called Blender 3D. Your first 3D character by Remington Markham. Soon, I'll be able to digitally sculpt all sorts of fun things for my table. If you perhaps have a less dorky thing you want to check out on Skillshare, the first 1,000 people who use the link in my description will receive a 1-month free trial to Skillshare's premium service. On a serious note, this video will definitely be demonetized, so I want to thank Skillshare for giving it a sponsorship. Between them and my amazing patrons, I can make videos like this without concern. Thank you, Skillshare, for letting me talk about this critical topic. Speaking of which, let's get back to the content. Hi, I'm Tristan, and this is Step Back. Be sure to subscribe to never miss one of my uplifting, life-affirming videos. Couldn't even say that one with a straight face. So, what happened to the white power movement in the 1980s? If you hear about them at all, often the line is that this was when the white power movement faded into obscurity. never to darken our doorsteps ever again. Which was one thing to say a few decades ago, another when we live in the shadow of a resurgent white supremacist movement. And admittedly, there was a period of inactivity before the movement metastasized into the militia movement. Often what's pointed to as the beginning of the end of this movement was the Fort Smith sedition trial. You might remember me mention this in my last video in this series on women in the white power movement. It was the name of the trial Louis Beam ran to Mexico to escape. It was also the one he was acquitted of, causing his wife to reportedly faint. Louis Beam and several white power leaders did indeed quiet down their activity after the trial, but this might have more to do with them getting up there in years and wanting to retire. Still, to most of the movement, Fort Smith was seen as a victory. They were acquitted, and they interpreted that decision as a green light from the state to keep Naziing around. Publications didn't stop, and the preparation for a coming civil war or race war was still active in the early 1990s. The militia movement began to bubble up almost right after the trial in 1989 in the Pacific Northwest. It's important to mention the region because this was already a hotbed of white power activity. White separatists had an initiative to congregate there and break off into a white ethno-state after the big war they anticipated. The white power movement and militia movement shared many of the same members, leaders, strategies, weapons, and language. Many of the leaders of these early militias were members of defunct white power groups. Nonetheless, it seemed the mainstream press, desperate to avoid having to do real investigative reporting, tried to say this was something new and distinctive. Here's a description from the New York Times.
Some experts say that the militia members, despite their tough talk, are not as dangerously militant as the small movements of other armed conspiracy theorists, like the Aryan Nation and Posse Comitatus. But by all accounts, the militia movement is a much more widespread phenomenon, involving many more people in every region of the country, linked together by computer networks, fax, shortwave radio, home-produced videos, and desktop publishing.
So, where was the Times wrong and right? To say that computer networks and tabletop publishing were novel is not looking at all into the white power movement. They produced a massive pile of literature and used computer networks to communicate since the mid-1980s. Where the militia movement distincts itself from the white power movement is really just in branding. Try as white supremacists might, times were changing, and the militia movement was part of a change in emphasis rather than message. The white power movement always recruited and billed itself on anti-communism. The movement was born in the Vietnam War, which was a war to hold up a right-wing military dictatorship after it looked like they'd lose an election to the communists. The movement always framed its racist violence as confronting communism at home, literally continuing the war on American soil. And because of Cold War paranoia, a segment of America was ready to overlook the fact that these were Klan members and neo-Nazis because they were anti-communist.
They might be racists, and they might be terrorists, but at least they're against human equality.
But then, in the late 80s and early 90s, a few geopolitical upsets changed the nature of America's anxieties. The communist bloc began to collapse. The Cold War was over. Americans didn't have anyone to focus on as the thing to be scared of. 9/11 was a decade away, so the anxious Puritans turned global imperialists needed a new target. This is why the 1990s was a period where new and fantastic conspiracy theories ran rampant, and conspiracy theories are where fascists thrive. Among white power folks, the enemy in the US government went by the blanket term of the Zionist Occupational Government, often shortened to ZOG. Essentially, it's a conspiracy theory that the US government's being secretly controlled by Jews. By the late 80s, explicit anti-Semitism was a little gauche, so if you wanted to do it, you had to have some level of plausible deniability. But you could rebrand this very easily. You keep the anti-Semitism, but instead of outright saying the Jews, you say something vague like, I don't know, globalists. Just imagine every noun in the next sentence being in triple brackets. The bankers, the UN, and the media were all plotting to reorganize the world under their control, including the United States. And instead of Zionist occupational government, you call it the New World Order. Often they warn that the NWO wanted to enslave the white race, and any day now would send in UN troops to put white people in concentration camps. You could also say that this impending invasion was a sign that the end times were near. This apocalyptic rhetoric would help make inroads with the religious right, which by the late 80s were a significant force in American reactionary politics. Any progress on equality for people of color, women, or LGBT people could be spun as the New World Order and the end times coming ever closer. Before this turn, these movements usually recruited from bastions of white supremacists like the military or mercenary circles. But by the late 80s, they started looking for new areas of recruitment like street gangs. One of the significant last movements of the old guard of the white power movement was to make alliances with racist factions of the skinheads and set up recruitment networks in prisons. Soon after, significant clashes between this vast white supremacist network and the state would ratchet up this sense of impending apocalypse. In addition to the rise of the militia movement, we also saw the ascendancy of the militarized police. And I mean, if you're trying to sell the idea that the government's ready to start a war on its own people, the police getting bombs, tanks, and machine guns doesn't hurt your case. The militarization of the police is almost a mirror of the white power movement. The Vietnam War reinvigorated a frame of mind where violence focused on civilian populations. The war was full of very nasty mass civilian massacres by US troops. In a lot of cases, every person was seen as a potential enemy. That mindset came home, and it informed police officers as it escalated its war on blacks, war on drugs, in the 1980s. I made a whole video on this topic just to be a precursor to this one, so if you want the sister story of the police's militarization, you can watch that here. Major clashes between the militarized police and these white separatist types would become major dramatic media events. Americans would watch in shock as these battles resulted in chaos and death. To the New World Order believers, this was just a sign that their fears were valid, and it would not be long before their war with the globalists would begin. Now, let's talk about the first of these infamous cases, Ruby Ridge. Randy Weaver, a former Green Beret, moved to northern Idaho as part of this distributed movement. He planned to hole up on his property and homeschool his kids, getting ready for the apocalypse starting in 1983. Their move was part of the northwest migration of white separatists I mentioned earlier in this video. He was part of Christian identity, a white supremacist theology at the very heart of the white power movement. Weaver was noted as a believer in the New World Order. He even explicitly said he believed the Jews were behind it and that black and white people shouldn't live together. Randy, his wife, and their 4 kids moved to this county specifically because it had one black family in the 9,000 residents living there. Let's just go to Kathleen Ballou's description of what this home was like.
Up on the mountain, they built a primitive cabin and a shed where the women would go when they menstruated or when Vicky Weaver gave birth to her baby daughter. Randy Weaver taught Kevin, his son, Sammy, 14, and his daughters, Sarah and Rachel, 12 and 10, how to fire guns. They carried guns everywhere they went on the mountain top.
At least 3 times in the 1980s, they went to the Aryan Nations World Congress, and Randy wore a Just Say No to Zog shirt. There, he met an undercover alcohol, tobacco, and firearms, or ATF informant, who tried to entrap Weaver on an illegal weapons sale. The idea was to force him into becoming an informant himself and build a network investigating the militia movement. The informant managed to get Weaver to sell him some modified weapons, but he refused to become an informant. So they indicted him on felony weapons charges in 1990. However, after his arraignment, Weaver returned home ready to stand off against the police rather than go to court. His wife reportedly supported this decision, signing a letter stating their intentions to the U.S. Attorney for Idaho. Fellow militia members helped them supply the compound. The police were frankly at an impasse. They knew the family was holed up, ready for a siege, but they worried about the children at the site. And really, only Randy had any charges against him. They didn't want a repeat of an incident at Whidbey Island, where a house full of munitions exploded after a lengthy standoff with federal agents. Weaver sent the FBI a letter saying that this would only end with his family's deaths, so they also considered it a hostage situation. In August of 1992, federal agents shot the Weavers' dog. God damn it. What is it with cops and killing people's dogs? This incident started a gunfight, and the Weavers' adopted son, Kevin Harris, killed a federal agent. Marshals killed one of Randy's kids, Sammy. The police then escalated, violating their own rules of engagement. Without a telephone line, no negotiators could talk to the Weavers. Armored personnel carriers began to arrive for a massive siege. In response, about 300 white power activists began to camp out nearby in support. Police caught some of these white power members trying to get weapons and supplies to the Weavers. During this siege, there were more exchanges of gunfire, one of which killed Vicky while holding their 10-month-old baby. The remaining Weavers wrote another letter saying that this was a Zog/New World Order ambush. After some time, they negotiated a ceasefire with the help of a man named Beau Gritz. He was a sympathetic man to the Weavers who would eventually start his own white separatist compound. The event was highly covered in the media and made public just how far the police's militarization had gone. Kevin Harris and Randy Weaver both went on trial. Harris was acquitted by a jury, and Weaver only did 14 months for his failure to appear and illegal weapons charges. After an investigation into the conduct of the agents there, the state compensated Weaver $3.1 million for the deaths of his wife and child. The death of Vicky Weaver, though, invigorated the militia movement. They saw her as an icon of white womanhood, and her death inflamed their passions. And the fear that the government would soon come for them and theirs was at an all-time high. The whole family became martyrs to the cause. White power leaders came out of retirement, and an emergency meeting was held on how to respond. These leaders came to develop a new strategy of letting anti-communism, racism, and anti-Semitism fall back a little in favor of militarism and a focus on fighting the state. It led to an explosion of support. And almost perfectly timed with the trials of Weaver and Harris, an even more deadly standoff would break out, this time in the Texas town of Waco. In Waco, a cult called the Branch Davidians organized a paramilitary organization run by the cult's head, David Koresh. Now, the Branch Davidians were not the Weavers. They were less of a political cult and more one obsessed with a coming apocalypse. However, Waco, the town, has a long history of white separatism. Many white power groups like the Klan and racist skinheads were in active operation in the area. The group had been stockpiling weapons, some legal, but many illegal. It was only when a torn package showed that they were collecting components to make hand grenades that the state decided to get involved. Like many white power groups, they were also converting their weapons with illegal modifications, similar to other incidents we discussed earlier in the series. There was even an illegal mounted .50 caliber machine gun on the compound. Agents inside reported that it was a treasure trove of weapons, and the FBI and ATF decided to prepare for a raid. However, when someone tipped off the Branch Davidians of their plans, the Branch Davidians prepared for a siege. And siege, the feds did. For nearly 2 months, agents faced off against the Branch Davidian compound. White power leaders like Louis Beam showed up to watch and express support for Koresh. The end of the Waco standoff was a mess of chaos, fire, and blood. The compound was set ablaze, and it's never really been settled who actually set it. But importantly, the militia and white supremacist folks were convinced that it was the FBI and the ATF. And I mean, the feds didn't help their case by pairing the flames with the image of them moving on the compound with tanks and assault rifles. In the end, 76 people died, 25 of which were children and 2 were pregnant women. In white power circles, the victims were portrayed as an all-white group. They weren't. And the women and children slain were seen as a sign of how evil the New World Order had become. After Waco and Ruby Ridge, the militia movement saw a 50,000 person increase in membership across the United States and a ramping up of preparation to go to war against the federal government. According to the Southern Poverty Law Center, millions more considered themselves sympathizers to the militias, a self-described patriot movement. This is larger than even the high watermark of the KKK in the 1920s, the biggest wave of sympathy for a white supremacist movement in American history. I guess if you don't count the United States itself in that. Terrorist attacks began to ramp up with threats on federal buildings, public housing, and institutions like a black church and a museum of Afro-American history. And I mean, it's not far-fetched that this language has bled forward into the modern day. This will be a video of its own later, but the shift in language and emphasis of the white power movement to the militia movement has embedded itself closer and closer to the mainstream American right. During the Obama administration, many groups like the Three Percenters and the Tea Party used the language of globalists, the New World Order, and the like. Obama, in some evangelical circles, was even speculated to be the Antichrist. I mean, who remembers the panic of things like Jade Helm 15 or FEMA camps? The real crossover was when this language moved to the front of the Republican Party itself. Now the New World Order has been replaced with terms like the deep state, which makes me very angry, by the way. The deep state was a valid term for describing unelected officials in places like the Pentagon who kept an engine of imperialism running no matter how Americans voted. But now it's a secret group of thems who the reactionary right think are conspiring to take down their big wet daddy Donald Trump. And today, the language of the New World Order has shifted into the greater QAnon movement. Again, I'll dig more into this in the last video in this series, but still, the mainstreaming of anti-Semitic conspiracy theories in the late 80s and early 90s is directly connected to the conspiracies of today. Now they've more or less proliferated across the mainstream right in America. Even right now, water cutoffs in the Pacific Northwest to protect against droughts are bringing out the exact same militias I'm writing about to force open those closed pipes. Eamon Bundy, a militia leader responsible for holding up a wildlife refuge in 2016, is now threatened to face off against the federal government over this. This incident shows that as climate change begins to make America less habitable, these kinds of clashes will be more common. Who's ready for eco-fascism? So, back in the 90s, militias were on the rise. Amongst them, there was this real sense that an apocalypse was coming, a war against the triple bracket them for the fate of all white kind. One of the largest of these was the Michigan Militia, which had grown to 12,000 members. Though not reportedly doing anything illegal, it was well known they were stockpiling an absolutely horrifying amount of weaponry. An arsenal they kept loaded and ready for war at basically all times. They were getting angrier and angrier and hoarding more and more weapons. And one of the Michigan Militia's most devoted members, and the subject of the next video in this series, was a man named Timothy McVeigh. We'll pick up on his story next time, but until then, you got a whole series on the white power movement to get caught up on if you haven't. So just click there and get started. And I'll see you guys next time.